A phrase that I've recently coined to describe the work that I do broadly, that encompasses cult psychology and coaching scams and ethical business, is the intersection of cults, cons, and capitalism. And maybe I didn't coin the term, it could have been just downloaded to my consciousness from the collective cloud. But either way, I've been exploring these topics for a while because they have so many overlapping themes that point to the same ideas that I talk about again and again when it comes to recruitment strategies and indoctrination techniques, media literacy, ways that we can protect ourselves from toxic influences in our mainstream society. I'm pretty familiar with cult psychology and con artistry, but when it comes to capitalism, I'm still very, very much a student. Well, I'm a student of the other ones as well, but I'm a newbie with dismantling capitalism and unpacking all of the toxic aspects of capitalism, which I've only just started doing recently when I got more into critiquing New Age spirituality and the spiritual materialism. So I'm hesitant to call myself an anti capitalist only because I don't feel like I know enough about it to claim that title. And moreover, I haven't yet figured out how to navigate my very capitalist life in a way where I can both dismantle capitalism and yet still benefit from it solely because there's no other option. And if there is, I personally have not figured it out yet. So in my journey, I'm still at the phase of understanding and exploring and dismantling my own internalized capitalism. So I'm still very much a newbie anti-capitalist, if I can even call myself that. And this is why I learn from educators. And one of my favorite educators online, who I have the pleasure of bringing onto my show today, is Rachael Kay Albers. Rachael is a writer, she's a creative director, a brand strategist, and marketing muckraker, which is a fancy way of saying she's a scam historian. She's also a comedian and she's an anti-capitalist. I've been really inspired by her work. I've learned a lot from her. And this conversation that we had on this episode was so expansive for me. It gave me lots to think about and it definitely left me with more questions than answers. And we barely even touched the tip of the iceberg. So if you enjoy the conversation, definitely check out Rachel's podcast called Marketing Muckraking. I will link that in the show notes. In the sea of business-related and marketing podcasts, Rachel's is truly a breath of fresh air. It's educational and it's delivered with a dose of reality and comedic relief that we all need in these confusing and culty times. So I hope this conversation will inspire you to participate in the larger conversations that we're having on how to navigate our world of branding and marketing and business without falling into the trap of toxic capitalism. Enjoy! Welcome to Conscious Revolution, a podcast about political awakening. My name is Margaret Daftian, and I'm here to help you navigate a confusing world of misinformation, hidden agendas, AI, and cult dynamics. Because it's not enough to just evolve, we must also resist and challenge those destructive influences that distort our evolution. Get in, loser! We're starting a conscious revolution. Hello, and welcome back to Conscious Revolution. I am here today with a very special guest who I personally look up to a lot in my own work around some of the deconstructing, debunking that I do about New Age spirituality and the self-help industry broadly. So just to give a little bit of context here, the self-help industry, it's been criticized as being baked into the wellness industrial complex, which is the intersection between wellness and capitalism. And it's specifically critiqued because of the way that our wellness has been commodified and resold and repackaged by capitalism to sell us solutions that it largely is responsible for creating in the first place. So a couple of episodes ago, I talked about the money cult, which is alluding to this idea that our obsession with money as a marker of success and happiness and wellness, when that gets convoluted, like our actual wellness, we end up quite unwell. We end up a sick and unwell and broken society. So I'm absolutely fascinated by this topic, and my guest today, Rachael Kay Albers, also known as RKA. She is a wealth of knowledge about the intersection of capitalism and self-help. So obviously this is a huge topic, and we're not going to be able to cover like every nook and cranny of it today, but I want to specifically focus on some of the narratives that we use, that we hear, that are really culty, and they're part of capitalism propaganda. And it has intercepted in the way that we interact with self-help and self-help literature and the self-help industry. And I think in order to do that, we need to have like a foundational understanding of how capitalism, or at least the way that we practice capitalism, you know, the more colonial and late stage capitalism, operates very similarly to what we see in cult dynamics, where there's a very much hierarchical distribution of power. It's kind of pyramid shaped, and it doesn't have people's best interests in mind, to put it mildly. So when that model intersects with wellness, it becomes so deceptive and so culty, because now we're sort of buying into our own self-deception to keep that grift going. So there's a lot to unpack, and I'm still unpacking so much of it. And Rachael has been such a huge source of education and inspiration for me to kind of wrap my head around all of this. I recently saw someone comment under Rachael's post that she helps make things make sense. And I completely agree with that. It's so easy to get kind of sideswiped in all of this. So I'm really grateful to have educators like Rachael to guide some of these more complex and nuanced conversations. So I am so excited and honored to have Rachael Kay Albers, RKA, on the show today. She is everyone's favorite brand mother. Her wit and comedic delivery has delighted audiences around the world, including me. She is a creative director and a brand strategist at RKA Inc. for businesses that burn the rule book. I love that. Her fresh and edgy insights on the intersection of branding and identity and culture and tech has her featured on Newsweek, The Week, Bitch Magazine. RKA is also a giftfluencer. I just found this out. And her gifts are always trending somewhere on the internet, and she's gotten billions of views on her gifts. So I extend a warm welcome to RKA. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I want to take you on the road with me as my hype person. I feel like you gave us the perfect TLDR on this topic. Like, what else is there to say?
Well, just in case somebody only wants to listen to the first 5 minutes.
Got it.
They'll get it all.
Mic drop. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I just want to give our listeners a brief background about your work as a marketing muckraker. Can you just briefly tell us what is marketing muckraking and maybe a little bit about what inspired you to become a marketing muckraker?
Yes, well, I like to call myself a brand strategist gone wild because a few years ago, I pivoted after 13 years in business. I kind of pivoted from playing by a lot of the rules to finally just embracing burning the rule book down completely. And so marketing muckraking is the title of my podcast. It's kind of how I see my greater mission right now. It's the fuel behind all the work and the research that I do. Marketing muckraking for me is about, instead of looking at what brand culture can do for us, how we can build our brands and be unforgettable and sell more just for the sake of it. My more pressing question that guides everything, that how I look at the world, is what is brand culture doing to us individually and collectively? What is it doing to our society? What is it doing to the way that we relate to ourselves and each other? That to me is the better question than how can I make marketing work for me today to make a quick buck.
Love that. And that is a great segue into the topic of our podcast today, which is the cult of toxic capitalism. So let's zoom out and just talk a little bit about why, because I mentioned that capitalism is very much shaped like that pyramid scheme.
It is a pyramid. It is the ultimate death MLM. It's selling you your own demise.
Yeah, I'd love to give our listeners, maybe who have never really thought of it this way, what are some of the aspects of capitalism that make it culty?
For me, I think it comes down to a few key elements. One, the message that we're sold about capitalism is convincing us that this very thing that is harming us is in our best interest, right? So like you said before, it's capitalism creates the problem and then sells us the cure, which means it's a self-perpetuating. It's a brilliant, if you're just looking at it for how well it works to do its job, which is to continue to sell and to continue to get us to buy in, it does that very effectively. So it's creating the problems and then selling us the magic elixir to fix it. And then the problems keep coming. So I think that is one of the core tenets of why capitalism is so very culty. And within that, convincing us that this thing that is harming us is ultimately in our best interest, it trains us to ignore our own instincts. It teaches us that the very nature of being human is unnatural, right? That we must be reshaped in the image that capitalism is projecting back to us. Is the hallmark of cults, right? Like what you think, what you know, what you feel is wrong. So we're going to remake you into the image of the cult, into the image of the capitalist system. And so, yeah, I think it's one, convincing us that, the very thing that is harming us is in our best interest. Two, that we can't trust our own instincts, that we need to be remade. And three, ultimately creating the problem and selling the cure.
Yeah, and that is kind of like over a long period of time, some kind of indoctrination process that we go through where we get conditioned into buying into some of these beliefs and these ideas and these ideologies that are not true and they're not actually serving us. And that conditioning happens basically from the time that we enter school.
I would say the conditioning happens in the womb.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Even our pregnant people who are carrying the next generation are being sold a bunch of capitalist, and speaking of wellness, right? Elixirs. And so the cult of capitalism starts before we're even born, if you ask me.
Yeah. What I sense is this, there's an ideological devotion because in cults, there's usually a person or a practice or something that we blindly are devoted to. And I don't know if there's something like that in capitalism that's uses the same kind of ideological devotion. What do you think about that?
For me, I would say the myth of the meritocracy is at the center of this ideological devotion. It's the devotion to individualism, to the concept that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. That is a centerpiece. And I think the other centerpiece is the idea that to be the change that you want to see in the world, that you must buy the change, that activism, that reshaping ourselves, whether it be through our self-help or reshaping the world around us, is as easy as pulling out our wallets. So I think those are some of the ideological centerpieces of how capitalism is sold and resold to us. And like I said, it's self-perpetuating. And I think what's really interesting for us to look back on is I was born in the 80s, right? And so I was born into a culture steeped in consumerism. So for me and my generation, I think for Gen Z and everything that comes after, we've lived in a reality. It feels like it's always been this way, that we were always, for example, a buying culture. Any problem you have, any challenge, you can buy your way out of the obstacle that you're facing today. And in my own research, as I've kind of gone back through history, because I'm all about understanding how we got here. I think understanding marketing history is to understand ourselves, because marketing is the fuel of the engine of capitalism. When we go back and we look at what happened after the Industrial Revolution, essentially the advent of mass production, when we started being able to churn out all of these items at a breakneck pace, what happened was we as a culture had to be trained to be buyers. We weren't always this way. We had to be sold into the idea of being sold to, because the early brands, the early advertisements that came on the scene, people, American culture specifically, my research is really deeply rooted in the American brand machine, which has then gone and influenced the rest of the world. But American culture was not a culture of buyers and sellers at its outset. It couldn't have been, right? But once we had mass production, once we had these factories churning out thousands of items an hour, suddenly now to make those factories profitable, to make mass production profitable, America was the first economy that was based around mass production and successful at it. Well, then we had to be trained to turn to our wallets to solve our problems. And this was uncomfortable for us. Edward Filene, who was the magnet behind Filene's Basement, and, one of the early department store tycoons, he described this as training Americans into what he called the school of freedom. And he said we had to be trained like students to see our freedom, to see the American dream reflected through our buying choices. And so, he very famously talked about allowing the students in the school of freedom to exercise their new freedoms in, whatever way they saw fit, but which through his view was, spending our time, our extra time and money buying our way to a better life. That had to be trained into us. And as recently as 100 years ago, we weren't good at it. So I feel like it's so important for us to remember we don't have to be convinced anymore to treat ourselves, to go shopping as therapy, to indulge ourselves through the next purchase that we're going to make. We don't have to be sold on that anymore. This is second nature to us now because we have been so well conditioned, but it wasn't always that way. And it really is barely a century old.
Yeah. I mean, if that is not a clear indoctrination process, I don't know what is. We are so deeply steeped in it. So I'm just wondering, this is a little bit off the cuff, but I've also heard this criticism that capitalism itself is neutral, that when you strip it down, it's like just the exchange of goods and services. And some people have made this distinction between late stage capitalism as being, exemplifying that excessive materialism and that consumerism. So is the critique more appropriately around consumerist capitalism or late stage capitalism? Or do you think that it's just capitalism as a model? Because I've heard so many different elements of it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
My muckraking background, is informed by I'm a law school dropout. Okay. So once upon a time, I thought that the, change that I wanted to make in the world was going to be in the courtroom. So I went to law school, got about halfway through and said, not for me. But I bring this up because when we were studying specifically constitutional law, American constitutional law, what we learned is that within the law, within the legal system, whether or not a law is truly constitutional or not is judged not only on its face, meaning what the words on the page say, which can be interpreted as neutral, right? Everything is neutral until it gets spun out into the human ecosystem and then humans turn it into what they're going to turn it into, right? So you look at what the law says on its face, but you also look at how the law actually gets applied in practice in the context of our real human, society, in the context of individual states and locales and places, and that is how the law is judged on both of those things, on its face and then in practice. So using this logic to look at capitalism, yes, you can make the argument that on its face, on the surface, the concept, the economic model of capitalism is neutral. But when we look historically and in the present at how it has been carried out, at how our real human society uses and experiences capitalism, well, it is very much not neutral. We have nothing but evidence to show us all the ways that capitalism is harming us. And what I would also say is, because capitalism is based on individualism and private property, right? And those with the most capital, the most resources are in the greatest positions of power. Well, because the folks who were at the very beginnings of capitalism, how they got their resources was through abuse, exploitation, colonization, the rape and pillage of our planet. Well, then the very beginning of capitalism wasn't on an even footing. This is what flies in the face of the pull yourself up by your bootstraps meritocracy myth, is the idea that we're all on an even playing field. Like we all started the race at the same time with the same opportunities and all, but that isn't true. So right at the outset, capitalism as an economic system started out non-neutral, right? The folks that had the resources got them through exploitative means, got them through white supremacy, got them through colonization. And that has then started the domino effect that led us to the late stage capitalism that we're living in today. So I feel like the concept that capitalism is just a neutral economic model is inherently flawed because it's practiced by humans. It didn't start at the advent of time. We weren't born. Early humanist civilization or pre-civilization wasn't capitalist. And so therefore, how could we see it as a neutral system? It's not, right?
So speaking of this excessive materialism and consumerism aspect of capitalism, I want to zoom in on that now because I think the capitalism propaganda that we have internalized as true comes from so many of these toxic messages around what consumerism and materialism does for us, which is the narrative goes that it leads to our success and our wellness and our happiness, right? So one of those main narratives that I see, and there are so many, and I was like, which one are we gonna pick apart? But one of the ones that I see, and this is actually what particularly drew me to you on Instagram, I saw a story that you had posted where you were talking about this part of your journey where you kind of had a breakdown when you realized that, holy shit, things are not the way that I thought they were. And, here I am building this business and doing it because I have intentions to make a better world and, create change. And really that realization that this is a myth, and the phrase you use, we can't capitalism our way out of capitalism. When you said that, something for me really clicked because I was on a similar path. And, I think most people who are called into any kind of helping profession, but I think in generally entrepreneurship, they have this bigger why where you go into this entrepreneurial venture because you want to solve some kind of problem. And this is serving a need, right? And so on one hand, it's kind of a double-edged sword, entrepreneurship, I feel, because on one hand, you have these aspirational reasons for doing it. You want to make the world a better place. You want to leave the world better than how you found it. And then on the other hand, you realize at some point that the game is rigged. And, that's that point where I think every entrepreneur does face that breakdown moment. And you really have to make a decision there that, am I going to just carry on and continue like turning a blind eye to this and play the dirty hand or play this dirty game? Or am I going to actually try to make a change? And that's that point where you got to really look at yourself in the mirror and decide, like, what am I going to do? How am I going to play this? And of course, that is also related to the hands that you are dealt. And not everyone comes with the same hands that are dealt to them. And that's where this, the factor of privilege comes into play. And you and I both critique how so many entrepreneurs, especially in like on social media, social media influencers, they just do not factor in the reality of privilege when they talk about success. And I think that if somebody's not aware of their privilege, I can kind of understand that because everyone's like kind of on a different trajectory with that.
Well, and that's the myth of the meritocracy coming back. People are trained not to see their privilege because we're told that we earned the success that we have, that we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. So I just wanted to drop that in. It's a design feature, not a glitch, that we are trained to not see our own privilege and also to not see the ways that might be being excluded or marginalized in some ways. We're trained to look away from that. And we're also trained to look away from the advantages that we're coming into the game with.
Yes, yes. And you and I, like, it just grinds our gears. And I know that, I've seen you like critique this too. And I think it's just so brilliant because it points out there's that aspect of social media influencer culture that almost becomes like an ambassadorship for capitalism propaganda. So they are actually the ambassadors of capitalism propaganda. And that's where shit gets dark because like, that's just like this level of sheer deception that, once you see it, you cannot unsee it.
This is the pyramid scheme. We are all reselling the capitalism to each other, right? And that's what strengthens capitalism while ultimately not serving us, because as you said, the game is rigged. The very design of the capitalist system, it hinges on a select few having the resources, having the power, and the rest of us, hoping that we can climb the pyramid and not slide to the bottom, right? And so it's based on us not all being liberated. It's based on the school of freedom is actually what keeps us in prison. So, that's how they get you. It's a feature, not a glitch. I got to tell you, my journey, I listen to podcasts all the time where, you hear like behind the business, the founder story of some big company or corporation or some thought leader or, cult of personality, right? And so they'll be like, why did you start your business? And, people are always lying and be like, I did it to help people. I just really wanted to empower. You always hear, especially like the lady bosses in the way, I just want to do, my passion is empowering women. No, it's not. No, it's not. So I'm not going to lie and say that when I originally started my business, I did it with some noble goal. In a way you could say I did, but, I started my business and I was doing nonprofit work. I was living in Mexico, which is its own, I will admit, its own like white savior deconstruction journey that I had to go on. I had to wake up to myself, speaking of privilege, along the way. Not something I would repeat necessarily, but I was in my early to mid 20s and I had gone to Mexico while in law school. I got an internship, and being there and seeing the people organizing in this town that I was living in and all of the creative ways that they were making change showed me that I didn't want to make change within the legal system, that wasn't for me. And so I decided I'm going to stay here. I'm going to continue the nonprofit pro bono work that I was doing. How do I stay? How do I do this work and pay myself to do it so I'm not taking money from some tiny NGO's budget, so I'm not taking a job in the local economy? Well, this was the early days of the laptop economy, right? It was 2009. It was the very beginning of when, people could become digital nomads. So I'm like, I got a computer. I got a background in marketing, design, writing. I'm going to start this. I didn't even think of it as a business. It was just like, how can I make $20 at a time doing odd jobs around the internet so that I can do what I'm really here to do, which is, this work that I was doing with young women and girls using the arts as a tool for education and community building. So that's what I was doing. So I started the business to fund that. And I did not self-identify as an entrepreneur. I did not care. I wasn't under some grand illusion that this business that I was starting was solving some sort of great pressing global problem. But I'll tell you what, along the way, as I got into the swing of things with running my own business, I got sold into, I was an anti-capitalist that got tempted, seduced back into the loving arms of capitalism, the not so loving, the narcissistic, toxic arms of capitalism under the idea, under the myth, like the girl boss dream. The idea that just helping other women specifically make money was a feminist act in and of itself. Because that, speaking of like what you hear people bullshitting around on podcasts about, like, my why is empowering women. No, it's not. But I got kind of seduced into that dream that I was doing something inherently good, inherently activist, inherently disruptive by helping women entrepreneurs and women-owned businesses or other businesses run by historically excluded groups, helping those businesses make a lot of money was in and of itself the change that I wanted to see in the world. And I did that, for a while. And there was this little voice in the back of my head, the anti-capitalist that I had been radicalized into was there, questioning, but I kind of followed that path for a while. And I was muckraker light in the sense that I was still very skeptical of the system. I was still very skeptical of the sleazy marketing practices and the bros and the girl bosses with their hats. But I was still too afraid to fully burn down the rule book. I was muckraking in a socially approved way, right? A capitalism approved way. And as a result, I was spinning my wheels. Like the underlying message that I was trying to put underneath my sort of like, more women with more money is automatically good was getting lost in that greater kind of reselling of the capitalist dream. So when I had my breakdown, it was me kind of coming out and saying, actually, here's what I really think, and allowing myself to listen to my intuition, which capitalism had told me was wrong, right? That's one of the calling cards of why capitalism is a cult. Finally allowing myself to drop back into not just like my inner knowing, like, to use wellness speak, but informed by my research and my historical understanding and my observations and lived experiences in the world, and informed by the current state of capitalism all over the globe, right? Finally allowing myself to listen to that instead of being, gaslit into like the girl boss prosperity gospel bullshit. And so that was the transition for me was, I came into it as a radical. I got seduced into the girl boss myth that just making more money is inherently good. And then I finally disrupted that. But what's scary about disrupting that is I think the bad news that I have to bring people when I talk about this is that to run a business ethically, to reapproach your business from a lens that is inherently critical of the capitalist system that we all must live within, means to part with profits, because the ethical way will never be the most profitable way. And that is what I mean when I say we can't capitalism ourselves out of capitalism, meaning the answer to our problems is not more good people, more good girl bosses, more good whatever. It's not more good people having more money. And to embrace the reality of the system and its harms is to leave money on the table, inherently to make peace with the fact that you're leaving money on the table, because to grab up all of the dollars off the table means to completely lean into all of the worst, most exploitative parts of the system. That is a very hard, and also speaking of privilege, it's a privilege to make that choice. Like, my work with entrepreneurs and with businesses in terms of creating marketing plans, creating businesses, creating brands that are in alignment with their values is not about here's the 100%, harm-free way of doing things. That doesn't exist, unfortunately, which is also the bad news. And also flies in the face of the capitalist messaging that tells us there's an easy magical elixir, but it's all about making compromises, right? Which compromises are you going to make today? Because we're all making compromises within capitalism. There is no harm-free reality, that there's no like get out of capitalism free card that we can pull. And then we're just like parachute into some utopia that exists somewhere on the planet that isn't influenced by or piggybacking off of capitalism's harms. That doesn't exist. When you accept this and you start to decide which compromises you're going to make, ultimately, one of the compromises you make in pursuing a more ethical way of doing things is leaving money on the table. And to make that choice in a world where we're all fighting for survival, where money can be, the difference between life and death, is inherently a privileged choice to make, right? You can see I just opened up all these wormholes and more questions than answers, which is also part of deprogramming from capitalism, is surrendering to the fact that there is no easy answer with a capital A, that there are more questions than answers. And living in that discomfort is hard, especially when we're surrounded by marketing messages that tell us that we haven't, just pop this pill, buy this thing, go on this retreat, buy this purse, whatever, and you will, escape the discomfort of being alive.
Yeah. Man, there's so much to unpack there. You took us like right into that narrative that I see it everywhere. And you mentioned it, like the idea that we can buy our way out of capitalism, or we can capitalism our way out of capitalism. And underlying that is this narrative that we need more money in the hands of good people, women, but also just good people, right? There's this narrative that is so pervasive and it's so seductive and it's so enticing. And I think at some point I'll get caught up in that because it's like, oh yeah, it makes sense, right? I think it's the same logical fallacy around like guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? Money is not bad. It's the money in the hands of bad people that makes it be bad. So the logical solution is more money in the hands of good people. And I want to like kind of deconstruct that because like I said, it's so pervasive. And I think it is such an attractive way of hooking people in to their business or whatever venture that they want to do, because it kind of just sets this path. And then at some point you realize, wait, there's like so many impasses there. So how can we start deconstructing that?
Okay, here's where it's going to like totally scramble your brain. This is it. This is the journey that we're all on, is that it's not wrong, but it's not right. And here's what I mean by that. More money in the hands of good people today in the world we live in right now isn't inherently a bad thing, right? But it's an interim measure towards the better world that we seek. It is not the end game. And I think that's where people get lost. Because of course, today, we're living in the reality of capitalism. We all must make, earn, find, and spend money to survive. We don't currently have some sort of a utopia that we can escape to. We're all living in a commune and just bartering. And, I'm sure those things do exist in tiny vacuums, but not as a sustainable practice for the entire global population. So do I think that, are there people that I would rather have billions of dollars than Jeff Bezos? Absolutely. At the same time, why is this not the end game? Why does this fall short? Why does selling this myth ultimately keep us trapped? Because one, the concept that more good people with money is the answer is inherently paternalistic, right? It's, feeds right into the white supremacist patriarchy. It operates under the lie that the folks best equipped to guide our world and to make change are the ones who have the most capital. So therefore, it is inherently undemocratic, right? This concept that more money that in the hands of good people is the change that we need. And also, it means that, all of the power is concentrated in the hands of folks with a very specific set of skills. the skill of accumulating wealth, the skill of accumulating capital requires one to lean into exploitation, requires one to turn away from the harms of what it takes to accumulate all of that capital, right? So this is why this is not, to accumulate a large amount of money, there is no way to do that doesn't lean on hurting people, period, end of story. And like I said, also, this means instead of a democratic society, we're given ourselves over to a dictatorship of the rich, right? And I don't think that business skills, the skill of accumulating capital, equips you to be a leader of how the planet is run and how to take care of people. So that's why it's an interim measure and not the end game. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I traced that back to prosperity gospel because it sounds like that's kind of where it comes from. I don't know if it's even before that, or I don't know, maybe it's just a logical fallacy around how the world works. Like, this just world fallacy that somehow the world has a way of regulating itself because we're all like spiritually guided, and the market itself is self-regulatory and it's guided by its own inherent principles.
It's guided by the Lord.
Yeah.
It's guided by our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. But what's interesting about even the prosperity gospel and even this concept that God wants you to be rich is basically it. And that those who are wealthy manifest destiny, right? Those who have the resources, that's been divinely ordained, right? Like God chose you to be rich, right? Which is interesting because it's, a little bit flies in the face of pull yourself by your bootstraps, but not quite. But what's interesting about that message is that it aligns with the history of the training of us into buying culture. Because before mass production, before the Industrial Revolution, before we had factories cranking out thousands of goods at a time, the narrative, the Christian narrative, specifically in the United States, was actually that discomfort, embracing discomfort, that rugged, hardy individual. We lived in a very rural economy until the late 1800s, early 20th century. The Christian message then was that pain was your way of getting closer to God. Right. And so that you working and sweating and toiling in the fields or even toiling in a factory, your discomfort, your pain was, how you showed your piety. Right. And with the shift in economy based around mass production, that narrative had to change into it's not the Christian ideal is no longer to suffer for the Lord. The Christian ideal is to prosper for the Lord. And that now you can buy your way to comfort. And that is God's favor shining down on you, right? And so also that, reinforces all of these myths because the folks who have money believe simultaneously that one, I earned this, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. And two, maybe I do have privilege, but that privilege was given to me by God himself who wants me to be rich. It's my reward, right? Because I'm such a good, devoted servant. So even the prosperity gospel has changed, was a response to our evolving economy and the need to now, train us into the school of freedom, i.e., buying culture.
Well, I would be so curious to know if you've come across in your research about any economic models are anti-capitalist and, can actually incorporate more of a web of life rather than a pyramid-shaped structure. Have you, in your research, encountered anything, or what do you feel like the solution to capitalism is?
So I'm going to give you more questions than answers because that's my thing. Yes, of course. There's lots of models. There's lots of alternative practices. There are alternative communities and economic systems being experimented with here in the US. I think when we look at unions and how unions are democratizing the workplace or attempting to, when we look at worker-owned collectives, when we think about kind of economic and political systems, I'm attracted to democratic socialism. But all of the things that I've just mentioned to me are interim steps. And so to bring it back to the myth of individualism, that the best way, because I think when we're deprogramming from the cult of capitalism, we have to detach ourselves from the lie that this is the best we've ever had. So just deal with it. Okay, well, I know capitalism isn't perfect, but you know what? It could be worse. It's the best we've ever had. So let's just stay. Capitalism isn't the best we've ever had. So what's your solution, Rachel? What are you proposing that we do instead? And my non-answer answer is that I don't know. And neither do you. And neither does he or she or they. But we know. And so I think I talk about these interim measures. I talk about union organizing. I talk about, worker-owned collectives. I talk about moving towards a more democratic socialist government, and economic structure. All of that to me is a stepping stone while we are collectively deconstructing and deprogramming from the cult of capitalism. The answer lies in the us that we haven't become yet.
We're trained to fear it because the other alternative is communism. And we're like deathly afraid of communism.
Yes, exactly.
Because it can't just be something in between, right? It has to either be this one extreme to the other.
Well, you talk about propaganda, right? And so the entire narrative in the United States specifically about communism has been shaped by, capitalist propaganda, but also because capitalism itself hinges on continuing to sell us the idea that there's an easy fix for our problems. So when you surrender to the idea that the better world we're building towards, that we must build towards something that we don't actually have a concrete vision of, because it's going to be our children and our children's children who will evolve into that vision, that is very scary. Also because individualism trains us to want to seek constant validation and celebration for our individual progress. And to me, being an activist today, being an anti-capitalist today means surrendering to planting seeds in a garden that we won't see flourish at their greatest, right? Like, you're contributing towards a greater good that you won't fully get to experience. And that is totally contradictory to everything that we're trained to want to be. And so for me, it comes down to we've got some work to do to deconstruct and evolve out of this before we can find the answer, right? Which we know there isn't the answer with a capital A. So I think all the things I just mentioned are stepping stones. But I'll be honest with you, I've got kind of this theory of change making. It's an evolving theory. It's constantly being refined. But I see kind of 4 types of change makers in the world. One is the reformer. That's the change maker who's working within existing systems and structures to make those things better for those of us who are here and now. Those are the people working in politics, working within the legal system, working at companies to make them more inclusive, to make them less damaging to the environment. That's one type of change maker. Then we have the fire starters. That's me. And those are the folks that are burning shit down and helping us to see what is wrong with what we have now. They're the ones that are helping us to debunk and deconstruct and all of the D's, right? Then after the fire starters, we've got the visionary innovators. And those are the folks who are thinking completely outside of the box. They are coming up with the solutions that nobody thinks are possible. Like, oh my God, their head is in the clouds and they're going beyond our wildest dreams and our current reality. They look, out of their minds, but those are the visionaries and we need those too. And finally, we have the bridge builders, who are the folks that, they've kind of a fusion of all the reformer, the fire starter, and the visionary. And they are the ones that are taking us by the hand and leading us towards this new world and saying, I know it's hard, but we can't stay where we are now if we want to, go towards the future. And so they're leading us across the bridge to, towards the building of that new world in the ashes of what we have just burned down. So I'm a fire starter, which means my natural strengths aren't in the visionary innovation. And I think, owning and understanding where your place is, where your strengths lie. We all have our moments of reform and our moments of fire starting and our moments of innovation. But I think embracing our individual strengths while understanding that it's not going to be any one skill set that's going to get us there. It's not going to be an entrepreneur with a dream. It's not going to be Elon Musk. It's not going to be any one of us. The beauty is in the rainbow is an image and an icon that I use a lot in my work that inspires me creatively. And it always is reminding me that we need all of the colors, that we need all of the perspectives and the strengths and the skills and the talents. And so the answer lies in us, not me, right? And that is inherently anti-capitalist because capitalism says you are the change. You are the change that we need. You can come up with the solution to the problem. Whereas the journey towards anti-capitalism says, I don't know, but we do. And when I come together with you and listen and contribute and hold your hand, and then you come and then they come, there is the magic, the mystery, the beauty of the world that we all want to create together.
Yeah, and that's what I always talk about is this path of collective liberation. I think that framework is so useful for people to start thinking about or continue thinking about where they sort of are on that spectrum. And, you know, for those of us, for those people who don't find themselves kind of in the more activism role, but you know, they want to be more conscious consumers. They want to take more social responsibility just around the way that they live their lives and the everyday decisions that they make. What can we suggest to those people? How can just the regular everyday person sort of resist those destructive influences of toxic capitalism that intercept into our lives?
I think one, it starts with surrendering the idea that this is the best we've ever had. And so therefore we're done. There's nothing else to do, right? I especially think for those people who are parents or teachers, educators working with young people, give young people the gift of thinking outside of this system because we really constrain and keep ourselves stuck by continuing to teach kids, not that the very critique of capitalism is, pushing us into a communist dystopia, right? I mean, detaching from the idea, if, as you said at the beginning, like we need to be able to teach young people the rules so that they can learn how to break them. And what I will tell you that was interesting about, I spent almost 8 years in Mexico. And what I learned and observed while living there, and I was in the South in a state called Chiapas, San Cristobal de las Casas is the name of the town. So my experience is certainly not indicative of the whole country, right? Like, just like living in Illinois is not an indication of the reality of the rest of the United States of America. But my experience living in that area of Mexico was every single person that I met that I talked about capitalism with, when they were coming up in school, they learned about all the different economic systems without the pro-capitalist propaganda that was so ripe in the Cold War culture of the USA, right? We weren't even taught about the mechanics of communism, the mechanics of socialism, the mechanics of all of these different economic theories and systems. We were taught capitalism good, everything else bad. So I feel like detaching from the idea that capitalism is the greatest thing that we've ever had, teaching our children about these different concepts and theories and helping them to see the rules so that they can break them is one of the foundational pieces here of just living out anti-capitalism in your own life today. And the second thing would be to always challenge the little voice that's been trained inside of you to say that the answer to our problems is to buy the change, that being an activist means pulling out our wallets, that the corporations that we buy from can be trusted to make the world a better place or not, right? That we can capitalism ourselves out of capitalism, that more money in the hands of good people is the answer. I think the more that we challenge that within ourselves, the more it's going to open up our creative thinking so that we can start creating new solutions and living our way into the questions that are going to take us towards better answers.
Yeah. Actually, I just realized that narrative is inherently so self-defeating in a way because it really does assume that in order to make any kind of social change, you do need money, you do need capital, which is absolutely not true. Like you can impact social change in so many direct and indirect ways, like what you did with volunteering or even just raising awareness about a cause you care about or organizing within your community or joining other advocacy groups. Like activism does not require money. It does not cost money activism is free. And the idea that like activism itself costs money is such a loophole of like toxic capitalism that it's like, whoa, when you really break it down and when you step outside of it, you realize actually there are so many more opportunities to make change. And it's quite empowering to have that realization.
There are costs, but they're not always monetary costs, right? And when we look at capital, especially today, there are different forms of capital other than money, right? We are living in the attention economy. So attention is currency today. So there's, as you said, ways to make change that are still leveraging a form of capital that we may have, but not necessarily money.
Is there such a thing as conscious capitalism? Because I see now this buzzword being thrown around. It's a buzz phrase, and a lot of these the coaches, the influencers that are jumping on the bandwagon of anti-capitalism, but they're kind of like doing it in like a very light way. They're using this idea around conscious capitalism, and I'm like, is that a thing? I gotta ask Rachel about it.
Is it a thing? Sure it is. I think going back to the idea that like there's different definitions of what conscious capitalism is. You'll see those definitions filtered through, corporate culture. You'll see it filtered through the kind of coachy self-help individual entrepreneur space. So, I mean, we could have a whole episode just on that and what it means and what it is and what it isn't. But what I would say is I would say I'm on a journey of pursuing conscious capitalism because I participate in capitalism. We all do. But what I would say is, like I said before, it's an interim. It's not the end goal. And the problem with that concept, as I see it so popularly used, is continues to sell the myth that we need more money in the hands of good people, right? So yes, I think any of us who are anti-capitalist and want to think outside of this box are in pursuit thinking like the reformer, right? The reform change maker. We're trying to make change within an existing system because we can't just overthrow it tomorrow. And, that's not happening, right? So yeah, I think it's an interim, but it's not the end goal. And I'm wary and skeptical of anyone selling that as just another elixir, another magic pill, because the whole conversation around ethical marketing in and of itself is like, I know that there's the sleazy way to do it, but I'm going to show you the ethical way to make a ton of money and not do any harm. Doesn't exist. That's a lie. Anytime you see that, like that's where you know you got a cult of personality trying to ensnare you. Be careful out there in the streets.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you for being a fire starter and kind of paving a new path for people like me who are more interested in this topic to follow. It's amazing to be able to have you on our side and in collaboration with you. I'm so inspired by your work and thank you so much.
The feeling is mutual. We're building the road together. We're on this yellow brick road together. I don't know where I'm going with these metaphors. Let's just leave it at that.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast. And if you share it on social media, don't forget to tag me at Seek with Sarah. For my ebooks, courses, or to work with me one-on-one, visit my website, seekwithsarah.com. I appreciate you hanging out with me. Thanks for pressing play. See you next time.